crazy news out of the state of Illinois. A state judge out there is allowing a lawsuit to move forward against the American gun industry, specifically Smith & Wesson and some others, arising from the murderous shooting of July 4th, 2022 out there at a 4th of July parade. This is a crazy decision allowing this case to go forward, but it really reaffirms that the United States Supreme Court in the Mexico lawsuit against the gun industry needs to step up and do the right thing and fix once and for all these nonsensical claims against the gun industry. Let's break it down when we come back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, so you all remember the tragic circumstance, the tragic events of July 4th, 2022, where in Highland Park, Illinois, a 21-year-old nut job shot a bunch of people, killed a bunch of people in a terrible mass shooting. Apparently, he used a Smith & Wesson rifle. The defendant who did the shooting has apparently been sentenced, I believe, to multiple life sentences, so he's never getting out of prison. And his father has been sentenced to prison as well, I believe, for apparently signing his firearms owner identification card of his son, knowing that the son was not appropriate to have a gun or something like that. Doesn't matter for the purposes of this video. The bottom line, though, is, of course, there was a lot of lawsuits that were filed, and as per usual, the plaintiff sued, among other people, Smith & Wesson and some other gun-related companies, and there was a motion to dismiss filed by the defendants, and it turns out this week, a state court judge, George Ortiz in Illinois, has concluded that the lawsuit against Smith & Wesson and some other gun-related companies can move forward, that they are not allowed or not able to be dismissed at this juncture. They're entitled, meaning the plaintiffs are entitled to go into engage in massive discovery of these defendants to try to prove their case that somehow Smith & Wesson is responsible for this mass murder by this 21-year-old nutjob who's now spending his life in prison. Now, this is quite outrageous in my view, and it's already gotten a lot of commentary out there in the Second Amendment community. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the basic opinion here by Judge Ortiz. Then I'm going to explain to you what the United States Supreme Court needs to do, and then I'll give you a couple other comments from other people in the Second Amendment community just pointing out how dangerous this precedent is. To begin with, the lawsuit in its essential form claims a form of negligence. Now, under basic law of negligence, the argument is that one person can be held liable for negligence against somebody else if, number one, the defendant, in this case Smith & Wesson, owed some sort of a duty to the plaintiffs suing, and that Smith & Wesson allegedly breached that duty, and as a consequence of the breach of that legal duty, there was some sort of causal connection to major harm suffered by the plaintiff. So essentially the argument here in this case out there in the state of Illinois is that Smith & Wesson owed a duty to the plaintiffs, the crime victims of some sort, and the claim is that Smith & Wesson had a duty to foresee that as a consequence of them selling guns and marketing firearms the way they were doing so to, for example, younger consumers, allegedly, this gave rise to a duty to individuals such as the plaintiffs who are suing now, because it was foreseeable, it was reasonably foreseeable that Smith & Wesson's marketing and business strategy could give rise to a nut job taking a gun and shooting up a July 4th parade. That's the allegation, and Judge Ortiz said, yep, that sounds good to me. That sounds like that gives rise to a legal duty right then and there. And of course, the argument continues on that says, because this guy got a hold of the gun and engaged in this shooting, this illegal criminal shooting, that was causally connected, was a breach of the duty that Smith & Wesson owed the plaintiffs, and it caused harm, obviously deaths to the plaintiffs, to several of the plaintiffs, and injuries to others. And of course, Smith & Wesson should be held liable for these damages. Now, Judge Ortiz, in addition to saying that Smith & Wesson did owe a duty, he also said that, yes, indeed, there was a causal connection, a proximate causal connection. This is going to be very important. We're going to talk about this in 1 second because this connects up to that United States Supreme Court case dealing with Mexico against Smith & Wesson in just 1 second. So specifically, what the argument here is that Smith & Wesson made is to say, look, we have no causal connection to some independent, standalone nut job over whom we have no control, engaging in murderous crimes. We don't control the guy. We don't know the guy. We didn't sell the guy. We didn't do anything with the guy. So what do you want us to do? This is no different than if someone takes a baseball bat, buys it at a sporting goods store and didn't hit somebody over the head and kills them. You can't hold the bat manufacturer or the bat retailer responsible in any respect for the misuse of the baseball bat, or the knife in your kitchen drawer, or the saw, or any of a whole host of items that one might be able to buy at a hardware store. You're not going to hold these people liable, for example, if you make a hammer and somebody uses a hammer to hit somebody over the head and kill them. So that is essentially the argument Smith & Wesson made, but basically the judge said, no, we think you owed a duty to these plaintiffs, and it was foreseeable given the way you marketed your product, according to the allegations, focusing on young folks, and because the nut job that committed the murder was 21 and thus deemed young, we think that's sufficient to allege at this point in the case a causal connection arising from the breach of the duty you, Smith & Wesson, and the gun-related companies owed to these plaintiffs. And then, of course, this is key. Smith & Wesson asserted the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLCA, right? And under PLCA, as you know, there basically says that the gun industry is generally immune from these kind of lawsuits brought against gun companies arising from the intentional criminal conduct of people that are misusing these firearms. This law was enacted in 2005 at the urging not only of the Second Amendment community, because obviously if you don't have guns, you don't have a Second Amendment. It was also enacted at the urging of the military and the Pentagon, because if you don't have a domestic firearms industry, you can't supply guns to the military, and likewise the domestic law enforcement agencies, because again, if you don't have a domestic arms industry, you can't sell guns to the cops. And of course, the last thing we want to be doing in America is being dependent upon our firearms and weapon systems from the goodness and mercy of strangers like China and Russia and the like. We want to be independent when it comes to our military prowess, including firearms, not just for Second Amendment reasons, constitutional reasons, but also for domestic law enforcement and military purposes. So in light of all of this, in 2005, President George W. Bush enacted in law and signed into law what was enacted by Congress, the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, PLCA. And again, this was asserted in this case, but Judge Ortiz says, no, that doesn't apply because under PLCA, there is an exception. In fact, there are 6 exceptions to the rule that says you cannot hold gun companies liable for the injuries suffered by third parties over whom they have no control, and so on and so on. One of the exceptions is called the predicate statute exception, and here's what's quite interesting. Basically, the argument in this case against Smith & Wesson was that Illinois has various state laws. Listen carefully, folks. This is going to really tie into the Mexico case in a second. They have specific state laws that apply to the firearms industry, notwithstanding the fact, by the way, that one of the laws that are being used here was enacted in 2023. Why is that an issue? Because the shooting that gave rise to this lawsuit occurred in the year of our Lord 2022. So part of the argument here is that how can you use a state law against the firearms industry enacted in 2023 and apply it to a shooting, to a tort that arose prior to that in 2022. That's one of the legal issues here. Judge Ortiz didn't seem to care. It sort of fluffed it off and let the case, it says the case can go forward for all intents and purposes, with a few exceptions. We don't need to get into this. So anyway, the reason why this all ties into the U.S. Supreme Court is this. As I've explained to you on this channel before, and you probably have heard me in the media and radio and other places, I've explained to you that the U.S. Supreme Court really, they're going to rule against Mexico, right? The Smith & Wesson's case involving Mexico, where the Mexican government has sued Smith & Wesson and many other parts of the gun industry for various forms of tort and misconduct, negligence, whatever, arguing that the cartel-related violence, the gun-related violence in Mexico is somehow the responsibility of American gun companies and gun manufacturers. This was brought in federal court in Boston. The U.S. Supreme Court heard argument about a month ago, in this case of the government of Mexico versus Smith & Wesson et al. Now, I've explained to you that in my view, I don't think there's any way in hell that Mexico is going to win this case before the Supreme Court. That's good. But here's the key. Remember how I've always taught you, when you look at Supreme Court cases, It's not just who wins the case that's important. It's also, in some ways, more important as to how the winning party prevails in the Supreme Court case. Because it is the how, the rationale, the reasoning, the opinion set forth by the Supreme Court in that opinion that will serve as a precedent that can be used by courts all across America for years, if not decades to come. So the reason why I keep mentioning this Mexico Supreme Court case that was just argued is that the Supreme Court is going to rule against Mexico. Okay, they're going to. The only question is going to be, how do they do it? And this is the key. Listen carefully. If the Supreme Court rules against Mexico and simply says that Mexico has not alleged sufficiently, has not alleged adequately, federal statutory claims or federal conspiracy claims or federal aiding and abetting claims, that will be good at one level because the case brought by Mexico against Smith & Wesson and the gun industry will be dismissed. Well, that's a positive. But here's the thing. Why is that not so great for Smith & Wesson and the American gun industry when it comes to these state-based cases like this one of Roberts versus Smith & Wesson, which is brought in Illinois state court? It's because a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Mexico case that interprets the federal law in a way that says that under federal law, Mexico cannot sue the American gun industry or Smith & Wesson. That's great for the purposes of that case and any future federal lawsuits. But it will have no bearing whatsoever on state-based lawsuits against the American gun industry, such as this one. Because to the extent Smith & Wesson, for example, wanted to cite a win in the United States Supreme Court on federal grounds, obviously it would be readily dismissed by Illinois state courts by simply saying that involves the interpretation of federal law, and we're here in Illinois applying Illinois state statutes and Illinois state common law and state law. So an interpretation about how to apply federal law has no bearing on the state court case under Illinois state law, which means what should the United States Supreme Court do? And it's something that I've hammered home repeatedly on this channel and others. The proper decision and rationale for the United States Supreme Court in the Mexico case is to issue a broader ruling, have a broader holding that doesn't just talk about federal law, but specifically applies the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLCA, broadly as a matter of proximate causation to say that, hey, if these folks sue the gun industry with these sort of spurious, very tenuous claims of proximate causation between the conduct of the gun company following regulations all the way to the criminal conduct of the shooter, or the mass murderer, or the murderer, or the criminal, whatever you want to say it, that is never going to be enough under law, under PLCA, to survive a motion to dismiss under PLCA. If you have a ruling that says something along those lines, that will be very helpful not just to lawsuits against the gun industry in federal court, it will also be very helpful involving lawsuits against the gun industry in state court, because now you're applying a federal immunity statute, PLCA, which applies not just to federal lawsuits against the gun industry, it also applies to state lawsuits against the gun industry, and would also apply, for example, in this case of Roberts versus Smith & Wesson here in the state of Illinois. So this is another example where the United States Supreme Court should step up and resolve this case involving Mexico more broadly, so it has the positive impact of that federal law all across this great country. My concern, of course, is the way the current Supreme Court, as constituted, is functioning, is they are very incremental. They only take a step, and don't do very many things that are sufficiently bold, in my view, and that is not really great, because there's decades and decades of liberal judicial activist precedent that should be undone, and we should restore American law to a place it never should have gone. But again, I don't run the Supreme Court. They're going to do their own thing, but I'm telling you that we want a broad ruling in that Mexico case, so it will cover and protect the gun industry in cases like this Roberts versus Smith & Wesson case pending in Illinois state court, applying Illinois state law. Now, I just want to give you a couple quotes from the Second Amendment Foundation that I thought were quite powerful, criticizing this decision by Judge Ortiz, allowing this case against Smith & Wesson and other members of the gun industry to move forward. I think it's worth observing their observations because they're quite compelling. Here's a great quote from Alan Gottlieb, the executive director of the Second Amendment Foundation. Such legal actions are precisely why Congress passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, PLCA, back during the George W. Bush administration. Smith & Wesson is no more responsible for the evil act committed by the Highland Park shooter than a car manufacturer would be if some drunk behind the wheel smashed into a school bus and caused a fatal crash. That's a great quote, and I totally agree with that sentiment. Then you have Adam Kraut, the head of the Second Amendment Foundation, adds on to Alan Gottlieb's point here. Smith & Wesson, like any number of other manufacturers in other industries, had absolutely no control over the criminal misuse of their product. Allowing these types of lawsuits to proceed only invites further litigation against firearms manufacturers to drive them out of business through lawfare. All right, folks, so there you have it. We'll keep you apprised as this case proceeds. And again, the big thing is, what is the U.S. Supreme Court going to do in the Mexico versus Smith & Wesson case? We want a broad win for the gun industry and not a narrow one. A win is a win, yes, but again, you understand why. We want a broad win, which will have a ripple effect favorably to the gun industry, which means, by extension, a favorable win for the Second Amendment, our right to keep and bear arms, because ultimately consumers pay the price of the cost of these litigations. As you know, these gun companies get sued, they're going to pass the cost of the lawyers and the insurance on to us, the consumers. So we all have a vested interest, not just to protect our Second Amendment rights, but also our pocketbook is a consideration as well. All right, folks, so there you have it. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at @4boxofdarn. Don't forget to subscribe both on YouTube and Rumble. I'll talk to you again soon, real soon, I hope, here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.